I don't really understand. Oh, we don't want this to be recorded. My name is Dawn Halston, and I welcome you to this Natural Resources team meeting. And we are pleased to have Tim Rumage, who's Professor of Environmental Studies, with us this evening. And he's Professor of Environmental Studies at Ringling College of Art and Design. He is the coordinator and developer of this program, and he teaches courses on environmental science, sustainability, creating ecological cities, amongst many other things. And he's also a trained field biologist. He's done research on marine mammals, pelagic birds, bats, habit restoration, and land planning. He's a planetary ethicist and naturalist. And I think I'm going to let Tim take it from there.
Okay, thank you very much.
This evening.
So the title is "It's Time for Our Metamorphosis Regarding Climate Change." And I'll get more into that a little bit later, but let me just sort of update you on some of the current statistics of where we are with climate. End of January, we had 419.47 parts per million of CO2 into in the atmosphere, which is up significantly from where we evolved from. Humans have been on the planet for about 350,000 years. In our earlier time periods, CO2 ran from about 160 parts per million to 280 parts per million. It wasn't until we got closer to the 1950s that we broke the 300 line. And as it says, now we're at 419. So to sort of put this in other scales to have it make a little bit more sense. If you sort of want to measure stuff, when we were evolving, our CO2 range went from about 1.5 feet above the ground to, say, 2.5, 2 3/4 feet. Now it's about 4 feet up. And if I look at all the greenhouse gas contributions, it's close to 4.5 feet. Where we're supposed to be in 2050 estimate at the moment is that we'll be at around, well, the original estimate was 520. And you'll see that that's now considered a very low estimate, but that'll be about 5 feet high to about 6 feet high for the higher level of all greenhouse gases. And by 2100, the stick would have to be about 10 feet 9 inches tall to be where our level of CO2 is. So you can see we're off the mark and we're sort of headed in the wrong direction. And as far as the temperature rise is going to go, most of it is being driven by the trapping of greenhouse gases and the heat that they cause and hold in the upper atmosphere. What the sun's component happens to be, is this wavy line right here. Historically, from ice cores, we know where CO2 was. This is CO2 emissions in the modern era. And then the combined up and down here with now this long trend going up, that's what the actual physical measurement of temperature happens to be. If I look at all the greenhouse gases, so that's the carbon dioxide, it's the methane, nitrous oxide, and the fluorinated carbon compounds that are used primarily, they're all synthetic, they're all human-made, which are used a lot in fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, industrial gases, propellants, things along that line. We would be at 500 parts per million of those things. And this is why I say in the last slide, the estimates we now have for beyond 2050 are often are going to be low because we hit 500 parts per million for all greenhouse gases this year. And nobody thought that would happen before 2050. So we're running ahead of ourselves here by quite a bit. For people concerned about sea level rise, we're seeing a lot of ice lost in the Antarctic. Now, when the ice shelf melts or icebergs break off, that does not increase sea level rise directly because that stuff is already floating. It will increase sea level rise as it melts and we change the density of seawater. As we get away, as we get away from 4 degrees Celsius, water becomes less dense, takes up more space. And so as it warms, sea level rise will go along with that. Right now, Antarctica loses about 25 million tons of ice per hour. Okay? And that's a flow rate faster than Niagara Falls. It's enough water to fill up 167 Olympic swimming pools every second. Okay, so whatever helps give you some idea of volume, those are some thoughts that you can play with. This is a series of sort of recent images. The Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, which is referred to frequently as the Doomsday Glacier. It is the fastest melting glacier we have and locks in at the moment several feet of sea level rise. But it is a glacier that is now melting in ways people had not seen before. What's going on is we have warm salt water that is able now to get underneath the glacier. So the glacier is being melted from the bottom. Higher temperatures are melting it from the top. We also know that even though we've got katabatic winds, these are those Antarctic winds that start in the center of the continent and run down slope, pushing towards the ocean, that the glacier itself is melting back because of the increase in air temperature and the increase in ocean temperature. So, it's melting faster than it's moving. The other thing that happens here is that, to keep in mind, is that the white part of the glacier reflects sunlight back. That's a cooling process. But as more ice melts and we have the darker ocean exposed, that's absorbing sun's heat and speeding up the rate of melt. Also, with the melt that's on the surface, we get algae growth in that, and that algae is colored. Most of it's in the reds and greens, but those then also absorb more heat on the surface of the glacier, again, speeding up the rate of surface melt. And the picture was published yesterday. It's this one. This is what the underside of this leading edge looks like. And what you see are these long slits in it. So what they're finding is that these long slits have more heat and more salt in them, which melt the glaciers. So all these pieces become narrower, but the narrowness is melting faster than the thickness of them. So historically, that means where calculations have been done about thickness, we now know that was giving us a false reading that the ice was melting in a different way on the underside than it was on the surface that anybody could easily measure or more easily measure. We also know that Greenland is melting faster now. It's melting about 100 times faster than we knew it was last year when I gave a presentation here. And part of it is that we have these moulins, these open areas where the water on the surface falls down through basically a mile to a mile and a half of open glacier. And until now, nobody had, I'm sorry, you looking for something? Okay. Nobody had figured out the kinetic energy. Okay. This glaciers in Greenland are about 7 times taller than the tallest dam in the United States. Okay. And we use the fall of the water in the dam system, that kinetic energy, to turn the turbine to generate the electricity we want to use. And so this stuff is, now somebody's done the calculations, it turns out it's generating about 7 times more energy than we're getting out of dams, in some parts of the country. And so they're thinking that just because of the heat generated by the fall, by the kinetic energy, it in of itself is going to add 20 inches to sea level rise by 2100. So what we've really seen in like the last 4 months is a whole series of papers that have come out and new data that's come out that is telling us that, what we were telling people in, June, July, August of 2022 is wrong and low. Things will be greater and faster than what we thought was going to be happening. This is a NASA model of sea height anomalies. This one's just for the month of June, but you can see that there's whole variability in sea level heights these days. And part of that is heat and part of that is current, stacking water up in different places. But, we're not in the same kind of stable environment we used to have, where there would be a few of these, but not this many anomalies. And the anomalies are now sort of really taking over. And the problem with some of this is that that's going to take the nuisance flooding, has been referred to, the sunny day flooding, and increase its rate of occurrence, especially by the time we get into 2050. In the 2050s, we'd expect that nuisance flooding to happen about 10 times more often than it does now. And the really large events, rather than being every few years, will become multiple events every year. And so we're really starting to see some significant changes in how all this stuff plays out. The other thing that's about to come into play is the wobble of the moon. And who knew the moon wobbled? But it does. It has about a 5-degree wobble. And essentially what's happening is, if you look in this upper one, as the moon wobbles, there are times when its arc is higher than the elliptic plane that we use to orbit the sun. And for part of the time, it is lower. When the closer the moon is to our path, the stronger the tides are, because the gravitational field of the moon and the earth add up and give us much higher tides and also much lower tides at low tide. But the farther off it gets from matching this ellipse, the less play there is in the tide levels. And on this chart over here, what you're looking at is what the general trend is in sea level rise at the moment. Let's go back one. And the moon wobble. And what we're looking at is the fact that in 2030, we're going to be entering the next wobble phase. We've been in a wobble phase for higher tides, but because sea level rise hadn't been that much so far, most people didn't really notice it. But this next wobble, it'll be much more significant than it was recently. So there will be, again, an increase in the amount of nuisance flooding, and again, implications for storm surge and storm surge in major events. just with general ice melt, we're expecting to see 14 to 18 inches of sea level rise on the Gulf Coast. You know, that long shelf we have that heads out from the west coast of Florida into the Gulf is why we get to stack water up more than other parts of the country do. But we're looking at not the foot that a lot of the East Coast will get on average, but we're looking more to the 1.5 foot range. Okay. And so and that sea level rise, that stuff's just baked in at this point. That's from the carbon dioxide we already have up there and what it's going to do. Whether or not we get beyond that is a function of how much can we do greenhouse gas emissions and how many greenhouse gases we can remove in the atmosphere that are currently stuck there. But it's possible to get another 1.5 to 5 feet of sea level rise on top of the 18 inches if we keep putting carbon dioxide in the air at the rate that we're currently doing it, which would give us potentially up to a 7-foot sea level rise by 2100. Even the 3.5 feet by 2100 is going to be devastating to coastal communities. And it'll be curious to see to what extent we can adapt to that level of sea level rise. I mean, who's got the money to raise houses and roads, 3.5 feet? So this has been a year of fires, and the last several years we've had major fires in the boreal forest up in the Arctic Circle. And as much as people have been concerned about those fires, the other thing that plays into this is that the fires are hot enough, and they're ground fires, as you can see, is that it's causing the permafrost to melt, which has held and trapped methane for years. And so we're now starting to see a more rapid increase in the amount of methane gases being released. And methane on a 100-year average contributes about 25 times the heat capture that carbon dioxide does. And so there are conversations now about, what happens with the methane bubble. I mean, right now, the major villain in climate change and global warming has simply been the volume of carbon dioxide that we are releasing. But if we go too far or get things too hot, then the permafrost will lose the methane in the permafrost, and that will generate a whole new cascade of and rate of changes. Okay? I'm sure you're all happy to have this information at this moment. Yeah. And recovery is becoming more difficult. Clearly, this is a community before the fire, and this is a community after the fire. But what we're seeing, this example from California, is that because of the fire, we've displaced a large number of people, and where can they rebuild? As the state looks at increased limitations on building sites, either for flooding or for fire, you are making it more difficult for people to be able to replace, their homes. And so what's that going to do to population demographics in California and throughout the rest of the West? And the other thing that happens in these fire areas, because of the high amount of property value, it is relatively common to use chemical dispersants to help put out the fire. And those can work their way into the groundwater and well water and require a huge amount of filtration, expensive filtration, to make the water table safe to drink again. So not only are you using a lot of water to try to fight this, but in an attempt to put a lot of stuff out, we're also putting the water supply at further risk. With the increase in greenhouse gases, the increase in temperature. We're also going to see more issues dealing with heat index and how that's going to play out in our area and others. Currently, if we look at the tropics, where most of the measurements, and even our area, subtropics, where measurements have been done, there's been a 15% increase in the amount of days that cross over into heat index health issues since 1979. In the tropical regions, by 2050, we're basically looking at half the year being in a heat index risk zone or higher. And by 2100, probably every day is going to get to be a heat risk day. And about 25% of those are going to be extremely dangerous heat index days. So how are people going to move? How are we going to redesign buildings to help better insulate them, to help keep people cool? The current electric grid cannot handle going to even greater, larger air conditioning capacity. It's also doubtful that if we went to electric cars and you want the cars to fast charge as opposed to slow charge, most of our grid can't handle fast charge either. So there's just a whole series of infrastructural things we're going to have to reconsider and figure out what to do. But this is the heat index chart, and so this is the caution area. This color zone in here is extreme caution. This is danger, and this is extreme danger. And by 2050, we'll probably have, I said, about 166 days in the caution area, 63 days, in the dangerous zone here. By 2100, half the year for us was going to be probably in the extreme caution days, and over 3 months will probably be in the dangerous days. And so, this is something that's really going to be important, because even over here, if we're just in the caution zone, this reduces the number of days that people can work outside and the amount of time they can spend outside. It's very easy for people who are working outside, unless they can take sufficient breaks, cool down, keep sufficiently hydrated, that people will get woozy and can injure themselves on the job. And so we're already losing working days for exterior work, and that's going to be growing worse. This is part of the Global Risk Report. This is done every year in January by economists. This is the paper that they all read before they go to Davos to make up their mind as to what to do about the world's economy. And this year, the group did something very interesting. They asked economists to rank what they thought were the biggest troubles in the short term over the next couple of years, and what were the big problems over the next 10 years. In the past, they've always done the 10-year. They have not always done the 2-year survey. And so this is the results of 1,000 of the world's top economists looking at this stuff. And I was recently had the opportunity to talk to one of the authors of the report, and he and his team were absolutely shocked at the 2-year outcome, because the 10-year top ones are failure to mitigate climate change, failure to climate change adaptation, natural disasters and extreme weather events, biodiversity loss. They have large-scale involuntary migration as a geopolitical issue, this is really triggered by changes in climate. You've got storms, you're flooded out, you don't have food, things along that line. So it could actually be, a green as well. A natural resources crisis. And then the last one, the 10th one, is large environmental damage. So we're really talking about, potentially as much as 67% of the 10-year issues all being environmentally related. But in the near term, very little of that focus is on the long-term problems we have to solve. Okay, it's short-term stuff, but by the time these issues make it to the short-term mindset, there isn't time to solve them. Now, these things have to be worked on in advance because of the huge extent to which they have impact. And because we exclude the adverse social and environmental costs of producing goods from their price, our economic system at the moment is set up so that we actually make poor choices. So that's one of the problems. Drought was a big issue this past year. This is the Great Salt Lake, and it is expected to disappear within the next 5 years, which on the surface of it looks like a water issue. But because Great Salt Lake has received water from rivers in a large agricultural area and industrial area, the dust in here is loaded with heavy metals, synthetic chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, a whole variety of things, so that when the wind blows and this dust comes into Salt Lake or the other surrounding communities, the dust here is a tremendous health hazard to people. When it was covered over with water, it was still there as a problem. It was being ignored, but now it is a problem on a regular basis. And last week, 7 of the top 10 cities with the worst air were all surrounded by the Great Salt Lake. So this is not a rare problem. This is a problem of growing concern there and with other areas that are prone to drought at this point. And the other thing is we're starting to see real ecosystem changes. It isn't just temperature or humidity or drought at the moment. We're changing whole ecosystems. This is the North Pole, 1984, North Pole in September of 2016. You see over here, there's a lot of white ice. Here, there's very little white ice. White ice is 5 years older or more. This is the ice that is sufficiently compressed that as a polar bear, you can walk on it, live on it, hunt on it, or as a walrus, you can live on it. This other stuff, which is 1-year-old ice, doesn't have the density of capacity to be able to really allow adult polar bears to hunt or allow walruses to haul out. And so this is a group of 35,000 walruses all on one shoreline, as opposed to being spread throughout this entire area on ice floes. And walruses have those nice tusks, which they use at the bottom of the ocean here to look for mussels and clams and things like that, because they basically eat shellfish. And in doing that, dive down, dig around, swim back to the surface, take a breath. They are the mechanism by which we move nutrients from the bottom of the ocean to the surface for the phytoplankton that then supports the zooplankton that supports the fisheries in the Arctic. And with all of these guys basically being forced in just to a few land-based things, we're starting to see a real decline in the fish population up here. The other thing that's happened is killer whales have moved into the area because there's more water and less ice, and they can easily get up into this area. And so polar bears are losing out as the dominant predator. Where that becomes an issue is these are narwhals here. And you can see there's a little bit thicker ice right there and some thin ice around here. All of this stuff is too thin at this point for polar bears to be on it. But what narwhals have done and what bowhead whales and other marine creatures have done is to avoid polar bear predation, they go to open water. Now what's happening is everything they've learned as a way to avoid polar bears puts them in a perfect place to be preyed upon by killer whales. And so we're seeing some real dramatic changes in how the ecosystem is functioning up there. When putting this stuff together, there's a question about, I thought about that poem about Daniel Webster, and you're supposed to, if you're at his grave and he says, "Neighbor, how does the Union stand?" and you're supposed to talk about all the good things the Union is doing. If I put that at a planetary level, currently in the near future, it's not good for us. A lot of the issues the last several years has been trying to get countries to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. So we've been putting out, 40 plus billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. And from those historic records, the assumption was, as I said, we get up into the 500s by 2050. Well, we're already there now. We'd be at 970 by 2100. We'll probably go over that by 2100, assuming that we keep business going as it currently is. Because this year alone, the world put 58 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Okay? So 18 billion tons more than we did just last year went up. And so if you want to think to the climate agreements, this is what countries are doing. Okay? This is the actual measurement of what's going up into the atmosphere. Here's what countries are doing. Here is what countries promised to do at 2016 at COP26 in Scotland. This is what countries need to do if we want to get to the 1.5 degree cap that people all agreed to in 2015 at the Paris Accords. Okay? And so we are moving in the wrong direction and doing it at a great pace. So we're in for some real issues, to the point that recently the United Nations itself, who have been hosting the conversation about trying to stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius or lower as an increase in average temperature, they finally said they don't see any credible pathway to do that at this point. There may be one, but from an obvious type of how would you reduce emissions to get there, they just don't see this happening. And I sort of threw these in because, as I said, we really need to change how we think about climate change. We can't think about it the way that I've been discussing it as sea level rise or temperature rise. We need to look at it in its broadest environmental systems point of view, its social point of view, its economic perspective, to try to encourage people to make the necessary changes. Because the future is just a real different place, and any rules that we've had, any thoughts we've had that have been guiding us in how we do urban design, transportation design, water use, grow food, anything like that, those are off the table. We're over 8 billion people now on this planet, and we don't know how to feed 8 billion people. We don't know how to feed the population we have. Hunger and starvation up until 8 billion people was an issue of, we either didn't have the transportation infrastructure to move food to people, or we didn't have the economic infrastructure to make the food affordable once it got there. Now we just simply don't have the capacity with our current agricultural techniques to grow the food that we need to feed 8 billion people. And so metamorphosis is this change of a nature of a person into a completely different one, a striking alteration in characteristics and circumstances. This is where we are. This really calls for a huge mindset change. Pope Francis, has said, God always forgives. Humans sometimes forgive, and sometimes not. Earth never forgives. And if we despoil the earth, its response is going to be very ugly. And so what the conversations just in the last few weeks have shifted to, unthinkable risks. The UN Security Council is looking at estimates of over 1 billion people needing to be relocated because of sea level rise. And they also describe sea level rise as a threat multiplier because it jeopardizes access to water, to food, healthcare. It can ruin freshwater because with saltwater intrusion, it could decimate jobs, take away entire economies. And so we now need to think about climate change, or as they now say, climate carnage. Is the new phrase that the United Nations is now using. And they talk about that we need unity, cooperation, dialogue, and the current geopolitical divides just are not allowing that to happen. And so we're fighting ourselves. As people get scared and they want to protect themselves, which is understandable, it prevents us from protecting the larger group because this really is about working together. So when we talk about climate carnage, they're talking about, the floods. I mean, this is a flood in Pakistan where, a third of the country went underwater. Okay. Climate change with marine heat waves. 42 degrees Celsius, about 107 degrees Fahrenheit. This was a photograph, infrared, on a day when over 1 billion shellfish died because the water and the air was so hot, they basically cooked themselves to death inside their shells. This is seabird wreck, birds that have starved because with the heat waves, the food isn't where they're used to it being. They can't get to it. Parent doesn't have enough energy to fly out, forage for themselves, and catch enough food to bring it back to keep the chicks alive. And so they're dying. All these really red spots, this is the Mediterranean, and almost no part of the Mediterranean last year was spared a marine heat wave. They almost all had it. And so, and so we're seeing things radically change. We're looking at sort of subtropical copepods now having potentially a larger range. The tropics is too hot for them, but the subtropics, what used to be subtropic, is now warm enough for tropical organisms to live there. So, and the subarctic copepods are having huge problems because they can't find places that are cool enough to be in the ocean for their lifespans. And the other obstacle here is that the phytoplankton that does really well in these hot areas is toxic to most of the things we need. Most of the fish that we eat, the shellfish we eat, and ourselves. So we're creating habitats for things that do not support us at this point. You got droughts. This is the Loire Valley in France. This is in China. This is the American Southwest. This is in Africa. These are becoming sort of universal events, and huge amounts of wildfires. this graphic down, this line down here is the average amount of wildfires in Europe. This was this year's number of acres burned. So 345,000 hectares burned. Multiply that by 2 times 4 if you want to find out how many acres it is. This fire in Australia was so hot, released so much smoke. This smoke made it to the stratosphere and is predicted to have slowed down the recovery of the ozone layer by 3 years. Okay, that's how much impact and influence we're creating. Okay, we're losing a tremendous amount of habitat. Only 3% of the world's land has an intact ecosystem. All the rest of it is sort of mismatches of parts. So only 3% has healthy populations of its original animals and is undisturbed. Okay, we do this on large scale, taking rainforest areas and turning it into agricultural areas. We do it on small scale. This is a subdivision that's going in near my home. So they took out all the vegetation and have turned this thing into dead soil. I mean, this is dirt. Okay, you can't grow anything on it. There's no living material in here. And the overall trend is that we've lost about 68% of the population of non-human vertebrates since 1970. Okay, we're just taking whole things out. But while we are losing habitat, frequently we do not lose the things that live there. They move, they look for some other place to live. And so what you're looking at here is a flock of about 2 million birds that are decimating the rice fields in parts of Kenya because there's nothing wild for them to eat. That's been destroyed. And so they're coming in agricultural areas and just stripping out all of the seeds there. And so as I said, this needs bigger thinking and it needs more international cooperation because these issues are across the board and across the planet. And I'm going to introduce, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the concept of black swans and green swans here. Because part of the issue we're now dealing with and now that you need to think about is that when do businesses change, or how do we get businesses to change? Black swans was a term for an unexpected negative impact on marketplaces. And the reason they were black swans was this was a term based out of the UK, and the UK only knew of the existence of white swans. So they had predicted that there were no black swans. And then, of course, they go to Australia where they're all black swans. And so this has become the terminology that's used. So the longer we hold on to the current economy, the more difficult it is to shift to the new economy. And the reason you don't want to shift too quickly to the new economy is, for example, if we're going to switch to renewable energy from fossil fuels, the value of your major fossil fuel companies, Exxon, Mobil, BP, their value drops to zero because a lot of their value is based on the assets that they have access to, all the rights they have to drill for oil that they know exists. But once that oil has no value because you can't burn it anymore because you're going to solar or wind or something like that, the value of the company collapses. And who wants that kind of a run on the market? And so people want to hold on to that stuff as long as they can, which is why this year the oil companies have their biggest profit margin in the last 5 years because, as the war in Ukraine goes on, countries are switching back to things like coal and natural gas as a way of generating energy because that's what they can afford price-wise to replace the cheaper wind and solar that they haven't finished building the infrastructure for. And one of the other things that popped up, I hadn't seen this term until today, the doom loop, is that as people respond to current impacts, that's where they put their attention, that's where they are putting their resources, which makes it very difficult to look at longer term problems and longer term solutions. So with Hurricane Ian and Hurricane Nicole, we're still in the recovery rebuilding process of parts of Florida. That's the focus. That's what the state's working on. The state is not working on, and other communities are not working on, how do I prepare for next year's hurricanes or the hurricanes 5 years from now? We're so focused on what just happened and trying to recover from that we're not paying enough attention to how to prevent or mitigate the next set of events that are coming. And so the concern is that you end up in this sort of negative loop where, because I keep looking at what just happened and putting my effort there, I'm not paying attention to what is coming. So what the next thing that comes is even bigger, and then I focus on it, but not what's coming after that. And I just stay in this, quasi near-term field and never get enough momentum to actually go solve and end the whole climate crisis. So we got to get out of an economy that is simply profit-based and maybe into one that's more, educational and creative based. But we have to make some pretty big changes here, and making those kind of social changes is tough to do. So the black swans basically are about protecting the current economic model. We didn't see climate change coming, and so we thought it was great to use fossil fuels for a long period of time. Now we know that there's downside to fossil fuels, but because of the value of the fossil fuels to our current ways of operation and thinking, we want to stay with the fossil fuels. Whereas the green swans are about the environment, which basically is saying the longer you wait to make the change, the more cost and damage there will be because you haven't made the change. And so we need to look at balance the long-term thinking and investment with the short-term reaction and repair. We historically, we're just not good at that. Both of them have, the black swans are looking at sort of unpredictable risks that once you've seen it, you can figure out why that risk existed. The green swans basically are looking at the risks that we know are coming, but and are irreversible unless we take action. But because we don't know what action to take or how to scale up the action we need to take, we're not taking the action. Even though we know how to do a lot of stuff, okay? We know how to bring environmental systems into the infrastructure of cities. We know how to build cooler cities. We know how to do vertical agriculture. We've got wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, electric cars, batteries, heat pumps, energy efficiency. We've got 95% of the technologies right now to solve the problem. We're not using it, but at a sufficient scale, but we've got it, it's out there. And if we prioritize those changes, we don't have to rely as much on some expensive and potentially unproven and perhaps dangerous technologies. In this one, David Suzuki talking about nuclear or fossil gas, natural gas, or carbon capture and storage. The fastest way to store carbon is to replant ecosystems, is to make healthy soil. If we take all the dirt that we have from subdivisions and homes and we're able to turn that into organic landscapes, we don't have a problem. The soil people have basically done the calculations, and we could end the increase in global warming in 20 years if we made soil as opposed to maintaining dirt, which is what we're currently doing. We also know how to do other things. This plate that you're looking at is a clear solar panel. Okay? This is a solar panel. So every single window could still make energy for you while still giving you the view plane. Okay? Even the windows here, and this is a timber constructed building that actually stores carbon. And when you grow its replacement, that stores more carbon. So we know how to take fast growing trees and laminate them together in such a way that they have the strength of old mature trees, like oaks and some of the maples. But we don't need to grow a tree for 100 years to get that strength. We can grow it in 10 and manufacture it into something that has the strength that we need. Okay? So we know how to do energy and energy storage. We know how to capture and recapture water and treat it through vegetation to make it potable again. We know how to reduce and eliminate the need for fossil fuels in communities. We know how to integrate nature services into urban life. We know how to feed people with urban, vertical, and indoor agriculture. This is a vertical, urban, indoor farm in Orlando. We know how to do regenerative agriculture, regenerative ranching, regenerative fisheries, regenerative forestry, regenerative economies, and circular economies. We know how to regenerate soil. So we're using this, not dirt. And we know how to, regenerate ecosystems and habitats. We know this stuff. The problem is that there's no transition between these two models. This is a leap. It isn't a set of gradual steps. We don't have, 50, 60 years to slowly educate enough people to go make this happen. Most of the people I work with and talk to, at the outside, they're given 30 years. Otherwise, so much harm is baked into the equation. It'll be extremely devastating before we can start to do anything else. And so, this is one of the things where, we just need to leap. We need to just change the mindset and go with it. And don't look back, because that's not the direction we're moving in anymore. As Carl Bard said, you can't go back and make a brand new start, but we could start and make a brand new ending. And that's really what we're about and what we're trying to do. And ultimately the question is, now, can we do this? But will we do this? Will we get enough people to work together to get us through this century? If we do this and get through the 2050s and to the 2100s, we pretty much fixed all the problems, and we should be good for quite a while. But if we don't do that, everything we are doing at the moment is making it easier for us and the species we're dependent upon to be phased out. And I don't want my daughter's future phased out. So I will stop there. Does anybody have any happy, cheery questions after this?
Well, it's kind of hard to be happy, cheery, but knowledge is power. And if we could just get this in front of every human being, or at least every consuming American, we might have an impact. But people don't want to hear it. They get caught up in their lives. And You know, it's all, I hate to say it, there's so much disinformation because of the propaganda of the money-making corporations.
Sure. Yeah.
That's one big hurdle right there to overcome.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
there's an article not that long ago about Exxon, where Exxon scientists in the 1970s projected where temperature and carbon dioxide levels were going to be by 2020, and they were pretty much spot on.
Right.
And Exxon never released that information,
Right.
and they got sued over that, and the people who were suing lost in court because the judge said Exxon did the right thing to do for what it was mandated to do. And as a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange, their business is to maximize return on investment to their shareholders. And that if they had released the information that their scientists had come up with, they would have violated that part of their business, their major purpose for being. And so they were right in not releasing that information so they could sell more oil, sell more fossil fuels to keep maximizing the return on investment for their shareholders.
Yeah, and that's a lot of the philosophy of so many corporations. And especially with the monopolies that are being created by big corporations buying up other companies and price fixing. So I'd be real curious to hear from.
And so I think that, to the extent that we can get enough demonstrations, we can get projects, we can get enough people to see these things and be curious about, really what is the option. I mean, solar, for example, and wind. One of the reasons I'm very fond of those two is that they're the current form of energy generation that does not require a constant flow of water. Okay, we've got a water crisis in the state. The Conservation Foundation says that by 2039 we're going to be short 518 million gallons of water per day, in this area. Well, if we were all on solar or wind, then that's a huge amount of water that we don't need to compete with for all the other actions that we're taking. So some of this is just to help in the conversations. It's not just about what we can do and should do. It's the fact that it also means there are a lot of other things that we don't have to do that make the benefits that much easier to do or more affordable to do because we don't have to do the other stuff. So, yeah.
I think John has a question for you, Tim.
Yep.
Yeah, hi, Tim. It has recently come up, so I'm asking, what do you think of this idea of replacing our income tax with a consumer tax, sales tax?
I don't like the way it is currently formulated. I like the concept.